The following conversation is a living continuum that includes every link of the coffee value chain from before the seed to after the cup. I'm Jesse Hartman, and this is the Coffee Podcast. Welcome back. I feel like I should be saying this to myself, seeing how we have not released content since April 2018, but hey, welcome back to us all. I'm excited to introduce to you the first episode in our series on coffee myths. Today, we talk about the seemingly pervasive idea that Arabica is better than Robusta. Joining us on the show today is Hannah Neuschwander, the Communications Director at World Coffee Research. In this episode, Hannah and I will build a sort of foundation for the conversation on Arabica and Robusta as part one of two parts within the Coffee Myth series. So hold on to your donkeys. Let's dive in. Today's topic, I feel like, could ruffle some feathers. I'm just assuming this. It's been an assumption that Arabica is kind of the end-all be-all of coffee plants. Am I right?
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think there's definitely a kind of consensus idea in the coffee world that Arabica it's the good one, and that Robusta, which is a sister species to Arabica, is the lesser half, the redheaded stepchild, if you will. Right. I think that's a pretty clear consensus, and it's certainly been supported by a lot of marketing over the years. You know, if you go back to the kind of second wave of coffee, if we're going to use the wave terminology, in the last half of the 20th century, there was a lot of direct marketing by big coffee companies that really emphasized like 100% Arabica. You know, that's how you knew what good coffee was. It was 100% Arabica. And then I think with the advent of the specialty coffee market, and especially the kind of super high-end niche stuff, it's like it's not even a question. You don't have to put it on your bag that it's 100% Arabica. It just is 100% Arabica. So yeah, I think that's a pretty firmly entrenched assumption.
I like how you said it's not even a question, because today it's a question.
Yeah, we're going to question that.
We're going to question that. Yeah. But before we can jump in and ask the question, I think we need to understand some of the basics around, the conversation, Arabica versus Robusta. We need the basic understanding of taxonomy, and I don't have one. I have super basic because I did a little bit of research on this. But can you break this down a little bit for us? What's the difference between these two words?
Yeah, so we're going to go straight back to high school biology 101. Don't run away from your listening device. We'll do this really quick. It'll be painless, I promise.
Pen and paper in hand, or whatever.
Right. So if you reach your mind back into those recesses, those dark recesses, you might remember, learning about, you use the correct word there, the taxonomy of life forms, right? You've got genera and family, and this is the branching of the tree of life, where the bacteria go off on one branch and then animals and plants on another. And in the plant kingdom, you have what's called a family of coffee species called Coffea. And within this family, there are actually 125-ish. There's actually more than that, but not all of them have been officially described by scientists. About 125 different species in the coffee family, in the Coffea family. Two of those species are the ones that we drink widely. One is Coffea arabica, or Arabica. The other is Coffea canephora, which we know kind of colloquially in the industry as Robusta. But there's 123, there's actually more than that, other species in the coffee family. And this is how these things are defined, as like it's biologists going out in the field and looking at the structure of the leaves and how things relate. Most of those 123 other species are not, you would never drink them. They are either undrinkable or completely unpalatable. So it's really these two that have emerged over the course of the last 2 centuries that human beings have really been widely planting and growing and trading and encouraging coffee agriculture. I mean,
Okay.
longer coffee's history is longer than 200 years, but that's the kind of global. It's been a global product for
Right.
200 to 300 years, and these two species have really they've kind of won the race. They're what they are able to provide to humans is what humans are looking for in a plant that produces a seed that can be roasted and ground up and consumed for caffeine and flavor. They are kind of like sisters or cousins or something.
So they're in the same family, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny to me because, these are the two species that I've ever heard of. You said, 123 other that we know of?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a lot of species that we don't even talk about. So we're not going to go down that road more than we already have. But it's good to understand, I think, the basics of what we're talking about here to get some perspective as we move forward, because it's going to get a little abstract here in a second when we start to talk about, defining what is better, what makes a coffee better. So with this question, first a comment. So it's assumed Arabica is inherently a better quality coffee. How should we define quality in this argument? How should we go about that, do you think?
So, better is, as you have basically said, better is in the eye of the beholder, right? Who are we talking about here? Are we talking about coffee drinkers? Are we talking about people with a certain kind of palate for taste? Are we talking about farmers?
Right.
Because the characteristics of these coffee plants, these two different species, are quite different from a farming perspective. And in many cases, I think Robusta is a better plant for a coffee farmer, depending on where in the world they are, what size of farm they have, what the sort of structure of the farming system around them that they find themselves in is. So I think this kind of central question of like, are we talking about flavor or are we talking about farming is really an important one when it comes to
Yeah.
But even when it's just about flavor, I think, there are some, I'm not myself a roaster, so I can't speak about this super authoritatively, but I'm aware that there are a lot of roasters, especially in that kind of second wave category, that use Robusta in their blends, not just because it's cheaper or whatever, but because it actually has some specific characteristics that are useful in a blend, like crema production. So,
Right.
There's people like David Schomer from Espresso Vivace who, are pretty upfront about saying like, we use Robusta for this reason. It's not the core component of the blend, but it's really a really important part of the blend. So that's part of it is defining, even if you're just talking about flavor, what do you mean by flavor or quality? What is your end goal? I mean, at the end of the day, coffee, as much as we like to sort of romanticize it about as being this sort of aesthetic experience, it's a product. And as a product, it's something that humans have designed. And any design product has an audience in mind and a set of kind of built-in requirements. There are buildings that are optimized for like factory production, and there are buildings that are optimized to be cozy family homes. They're just different. Is one better than the other? No, it depends on what your end goals are. And I think that is true of the kind of Arabica Robusta debate when it comes to either quality or farming.
So can we go into a little more detail about each of them sort of individually on their own levels of, what is this one good for? What is that one good for? Starting with Arabica, can we talk about maybe just two main categories as far as a farmer goes? Like, what should they put in the ground if they need something that's going to last a long time, endure, that sort of thing? Is Arabica, Robusta, is one of those going to be better for them? You kind of touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to see where else we can go on that.
Yeah, so it's interesting to look at the kind of where these two different species come from, like where they actually evolved and originated, because that actually tells you a lot about what kind of plant they are and how they perform. So Arabica evolved in highland mountainous forests in Ethiopia. These are densely shaded, high altitude kind of cloud forests. And they're sort of, therefore, they tend to work really well at higher altitudes, and be sort of optimized for that environment. Now, of course, we've done a lot of breeding and farming over the years to bring Arabica out of these shady environments into full sun. And there's lots of full sun Arabica plantations in Colombia and Brazil and whatever. But its kind of natural state, the place where it evolved, was in these shady mountainous regions. Robusta, on the other hand, it is a more genetically diverse species. It has more than one center of evolutionary origin in various parts of Western Africa. So that right there is definitely interesting to like an organization like World Coffee Research that's involved in breeding, because there's more genetic diversity available in Robusta than there is in Arabica. And the more genetic diversity you have, it's kind of like having a bigger toolkit for solving problems. This is one of the reasons why Robusta is, in general, more resistant to various diseases and pests, because it's just got a bigger toolkit as a species for managing problems.
Could you go as far as to say that it's genetically ahead of Arabica?
Well, yeah, in a way you can, right? Because Robusta is actually a much older species. Robusta is one of the parent species of Arabica. So Arabica originated as a kind of spontaneous natural cross between Robusta or a closely related relative and one of those other 123 species called Eugenioides, Coffea eugenioides. So Robusta has been around for a lot longer. The estimates on this that I've seen are it's been around for about 100,000 years. Arabica's probably been around for closer to 10,000 years. It comes from a bigger pool and it's had more time to adapt to different environments. So I don't know if it's quite exactly the right way of phrasing it, that it's ahead of, but in a way, chronologically, it sort of is. It's older. Circling back, to the idea of Robusta evolving in these multiple different places in West Africa, it is adapted to a wider range of environments than Arabica, which just evolved in these kind of high mountain forests, these cool mountain forests. So this is one reason why Arabica coffee grown in these kind of environments that look a lot like that, the sort of high altitude, constant temperatures, between summer and winter, not too much variation, night and day, not too much variation. Arabica really thrives in those environments. And it turns out that those environments are also the same environments that are really conducive to the production of interesting flavors, because you have a slower maturation process for the fruit. If you have a really hot, dry, sunny, exposed farm, the fruit is going to ripen faster. And when that happens, you have less time for the fruit to produce these interesting volatiles and aromatics. So the wine growers are familiar with this as well. For different types of wine, you might want something that's a little more like hot and dry and fast, but in general, that slower maturation process is going to give you more interesting flavors. It's, the plant itself and where it comes from and its history and its biology makes it very well suited to the same kind of environment that produces these really interesting flavors that we are now very privileged, I think, to be experiencing with the advent of the specialty coffee market, and especially the kind of super specialty coffee market. It used to be that even if you had a farm producing these amazing coffees, they would all get thrown together in a big pile with everything else. Now we don't do that. We can separate them and we can really appreciate them for what they are. Robusta, it evolved in a wider range of environments, but that includes lower altitude, hotter environments, more humid environments, some also dry. In fact, the amount of research that's been done on Robusta is not as much as what's been done on Arabica, in part because there's more of it and it's kind of just done a good job of thriving on its own. And so we haven't had to ask too many questions about its limitations, especially when we think about the context of, say, climate change, where a lot of places that grow coffee are getting hotter and drier. There's not a lot of high altitude farmland available. It's not easy for a farmer to pick up his or her farm and move it up high and achieve that kind of location where Arabica is going to thrive or where you're going to get that premium price. More and more, I think it's going to be important to look at Robusta and look at what its real limitations are and what just its perceived limitations are, because we're going to have to look harder at Robusta, I think. That's just the reality.
You're talking about the future of coffee now.
Yeah, I am. But it's not even the future. I mean, it is actually the present. So if you look at the kind of global trend for Arabica and Robusta production, 10 years ago, 70% of the coffee grown around the world was Arabica, 30% was Robusta. Today, it's closer to 60-40. So the shift is happening already. To some degree, that's new countries like Vietnam kind of coming online and being basically growing only Robusta. That helped shift the percentage quite significantly. But it's also farmers in countries like India, which used to be almost exclusively an Arabica country and now is much closer to 50-50 because India has had really, really awful disease and pest problems, and Arabica is just not as robust. Robusta has a very good nickname. It's just not as good at fighting those things off. And, at a certain point, farmers kind of max out on their toolkit, or it becomes so expensive to fight back these diseases and pests that it doesn't make sense for them from a money perspective.
So besides the conversation about what is going to sort of survive in different areas better than the other, or what's going to last us the next 50 years or what have you, I know that there's going to be a lot of people asking the question, okay, yeah, maybe they're not, we shouldn't pin them against each other, this Arabica and Robusta, but what about how they cup? What about how they taste? Like, could the argument be made that there's Robustas that could cup like, the high-end Arabicas that are available in the super specialty market?
I think this conversation's already happening. And I think that there's some evidence that really high-quality Robustas are possible. The question to ask is like, well, how do we define quality? How do we define what good is? And we have some tools available to us for that. And one of the kind of standard things, right, that the industry uses to think about this is defects and cupping scores. Mm-hmm. One of the really interesting differences between the kind of international standards for Arabica and Robusta is that if you are trying to qualify your coffee as, say, specialty coffee for Arabica, you can't have more than a certain number of defects, and it has to cup at 80 points. And I'm not a Q grader expert, but there's standards, right? They're pretty universalized. They're agreed upon. If you're a coffee buyer or a roaster, you know what those standards are, and you're kind of aligned with everyone around the world on it. There's no standards for Robusta. So, of course, if there's no quality standard, you're going to just have everything together.
You're serious? There's no standard for Robusta?
Well, there is now. So there's something called the R standard, which was developed by the Coffee Quality Institute, which is the same organization that developed the Q standard, which is the quality standard for Arabica. Mm-hmm. And if you become a Q grader, you're considered a trained professional, and you know how to identify defects and categorize how many defects a given sample of coffee has. And if it has, a certain amount, you would say, I'm not going to buy that because it doesn't meet my standards. Right. Until the creation of this R program, there wasn't a quality standard program that was universalized and global and a kind of common language that everybody spoke. In that situation, it's a little bit like what all of coffee used to be. I mentioned earlier, like you might have this beautiful farm producing amazing quality coffees, but it didn't matter at the end of the day because it all got mixed together with all the coffee from lower down the hill and from the farm over there. And even, from that country over there, it was just coffee. It's a commodity, it wasn't a specialty product. That's more where Robusta is at. It is almost always, with the exception of just a very few number of farms that are working with this R certification in the world, is almost always just bulked together with coffee from anywhere. It's not differentiated.
Got
and so
you.
Even just by introducing a standard and by having a basic level of differentiation, you're pretty much guaranteed to be able to get something better out of it. right?
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, doing something like day lots with Robusta, which I've never heard of, right? You're
Yeah.
talking about a lot of this Robustas being just mixed together. I think the super specialty market and the specialty market really took off too with day lots,
Yeah.
So I wonder maybe
Yeah.
that is in the near future. I don't know.
Well, and so there, now this program exists, and there's a couple farms that are working with it, and I think they're trying to figure out, can we produce a better quality Robusta? I think the clear answer is yes. So there are these farms available. There have been tasting events at the Specialty Coffee Association's big annual expo where you can taste R-graded Robustas. And they're better. There's always a range, right? There's always better and worse things out there in the world. So yes, if you just apply, good farm management techniques and take care with your processing, you're going to produce a better quality coffee. Is it better enough that people are willing to pay the premium that it costs to manage your farm in that way, or to, install the new processing facility, or to update your equipment or whatever? I think that is still maybe more of an open question. Is there a market for higher quality Robustas? Will people pay enough to justify what it takes? And I think that in order to know the answer to that question, there's still a lot more that needs to be done in terms of figuring out, well, what is the potential of Robusta? It's not going to taste like Arabica. It's a different plant. It grows in different conditions. Right. It's, I think, to have the expectation that you're going to get an R-graded Robusta that tastes like a Kenyan whatever. But at the end of the day, is that I don't think that's the point. I think the point is to find what is its unique, different, special quality that you couldn't get in Arabica. And I think that where there's a lot of potential for this is in looking at blends and looking at espresso, trying to figure out, there might be some really interesting attributes of good quality Robusta that roasters could do really interesting things with, but it's so unexplored. And it's so...
Well, that's exciting, isn't it? I feel like to some, that's like, hey, chase that down, be the first in that group of people doing that kind of roasting. I mean,
the whole there's this kind of whole trend in Arabica, the super specialty stuff. The idea or the image is almost like purity or nakedness. I as a roaster am not all I'm doing is bringing out the naked, raw, pure potential of this bean, and I'm attempting to do the minimum amount of damage possible to it, but I'm really just creating the conditions for it to flower on its own. And that's a lovely image. It's very romantic, but at the end of the day, it's also just patently untrue. When you roast coffee, you fundamentally change it.
Yeah, you chemically change it.
And that's the value that you add, right? That is the value that you add. And so I think there is tremendous potential for roasters to explore what Robusta might be able to do in a way that is new and unique, and we just haven't fully tapped its potential as a plant yet. And then the other thing I'll say about that is we also, more from the perspective of the work that, say, WCR does, we haven't done very much breeding with Robusta. We haven't really attempted to improve the quality of the plant itself, or to what we call genetic improvement. So most of the coffee breeders around the world that have existed over the last 100 years have pretty much focused on Arabica. It's not to say no work has been done, but partly because Robusta is more genetically diverse as a species, it's been a lot easier to just sort of walk into a forest or walk onto a farm and say ooh, that one looks good. It's really vigorous, and look how many cherries it's producing. Let's use that. And, take some cherries and set up a seed lot. And then all of a sudden you've got, tons of seedlings that you can distribute to farmers in your local region. But that's not that's a pretty old school method of breeding. And in terms of really exploring, can we target certain flavor attributes? Can we try to bring out the best in, or a certain quality in this plant? Very, very little has been done. One of the things that I'm really excited about is that World Coffee Research is now going to be doing some of that.
Yeah, let's hear about this.
Yeah. So let's see, we're kind of still pretty young. We're growing up fast, but we've only been actually operating for about 6 years. And in those first 6 years, we have focused exclusively on Arabica, and for lots of good reasons. But one of them is just the threat is higher to Arabica. Climate change is putting more pressure on Arabica. A lot of the kind of places where Arabica is grown, there's more competition for land and labor. And so it's harder to stay in the game as an Arabica farmer. So that has been all well and good. But I think partly as we and as the industry as a whole has come to appreciate the threat that climate change is posing to the long-term future of coffee, we've made the decision that we can't ignore Robusta. And there's kind of a couple reasons for that. One is there's a lot of farmers in those lower and middle altitude regions who it would be basically irresponsible to tell them, here, go plant this. Knowing that the temperature is expected to rise by 2 degrees Celsius over the next 30 years, which is the life of a coffee tree. So you put a tree in the ground this year, that's the next 30 years, you're stuck with that same tree. And that plant is going to struggle or fail. We can't do that. And so, Robusta is another option. I mean, there's other options too. There's cacao and beans and corn, but of course we want to see people stay in coffee. So, so there's Robusta just kind of waiting in the wings, and it's better adapted for some of these environments and some of these situations, but it also has limitations, right? And so can we create a better quality Robusta plant? That the main issue with Robusta is cup quality, right? It's from a farming perspective, farmers love it. They get paid for cherry, and Robusta produces a lot more cherry than Arabica. So in general, it all depends on how you manage it, et cetera, but it's in general more productive. So there's that. And then there's also this element of the genetic diversity of Robusta. There's just a lot more going on in the plant, and there are potentially some very unique traits that we can identify and begin to understand the genetic mechanisms for them, like heat tolerance. Robusta in general is more tolerant to heat. So how does that work? What are the underlying genes and kind of molecular systems that enable that plant to withstand higher temperatures? And can we, through breeding, bring some of those traits over into Arabica so that you've got the higher cup quality, but some of the kind of, agronomic performance of Robusta? So we're going to be looking at that as well.
Mind blown.
It's really exciting stuff. It's really cool. And the example, people might be like, well, that sounds crazy, but there's a really good existing example of this kind of crossover. And that is this plant called the Timor hybrid, which was people might have heard about it. It's a spontaneous natural cross between Arabica and Robusta that happened on a farm or in a forest on this island called East Timor in the probably 1920s is when it was first identified. And, typically what defines one species versus another is that they can't mate. They can't have sex with each other. But for whatever reason, they did this one time. And the offspring was this hybrid, it was half Robusta, half Arabica. The really important thing that happened with that plant is that it is an Arabica plant. So it has 4 copies of chromosome. It's called a tetraploid. So it's an Arabica. It can be crossed with other Arabicas. It lives inside the species of Arabica. But it brought over a genetic trait from its dad, Robusta, that gave it resistance to coffee leaf rust, which is one of the most important diseases that affects coffee farms around the world. And this happened spontaneously in nature. Humans recognized that it had happened and took advantage of it.
That's romantic.
I know, right? It's, good old-fashioned coffee romance. So, here, honey, let me give you this disease protection. So we already have this great example how that can happen in nature. And so it's very conceivable that we, especially as our knowledge of coffee advances, the Arabica, the Robusta genome was sequenced in 2014. There are now multiple projects working on Arabica genome sequence. We'll be making one available next week for the public, or, really for scientists. I'm not sure what the public would do with it, but
I'll look at it.
Yeah,
I'll look at it.
It's a whole bunch of weird data that's impossible to understand. But, as we apply these modern technologies, the kind of genetics revolution, we begin to be able to build a map of what genes in what locations are controlling these different traits, so that breeders can really be very efficient in focusing in on, okay, what are the things we're going to need in the 21st century? We're going to need heat tolerance. We're going to need drought tolerance. We're going to need resistance. We're going to need cup quality. So how do we locate those things at a genetic level and kind of pick and choose the best parts and try to build a plant that is going to meet the needs of farmers and also give us what we want in the cup?
Hannah, I think there's a psychological element to this conversation that we haven't quite touched on yet. And I don't know the full history behind it, but I do know that on almost every bag I see walking through the grocery store, I see somewhere 100% Arabica, right? Mm-hmm. There's this assumption, probably for consumers at this point, where they're going to assume if it doesn't say 100% Arabica, it's not 100% what it should be. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So what do you think about this? Is this going to be a challenge for the future of Robusta in the specialty market?
That's a really interesting question. And I would be really curious. I feel like there's probably some, especially bigger, coffee company out there that's got a research staff or whatever that's done market testing and market research to see how motivating that designation is, 100% Arabica. My sense is, I talk about coffee a lot to a lot of people, including people like my mom and my grandpa and people who are not coffee people. And I don't think they have any idea what Arabica means. I think they read it almost maybe what's more important for a lay consumer who's not, a little bit educated about coffee or invested in coffee is not the Arabica part, it's the 100% part, right? That psychology of it's pure. It's pure something. Pure what? I don't know.
But it's pure.
Pure something. I kind of wonder if you just switched it to say 100% Robusta, if people would be totally fine with that. Because they don't know what Robusta means or what Arabica means. Right. From a consumer perspective, I really don't know if people have a feel for what that means or what its value is. I think for people that are a little bit educated about coffee or that do have some familiarity, probably, the Arabica designation matters. And I say this from a totally uneducated point of view. Like I said, I assume that there are companies that have done market research on this and that they're making that choice for a reason. Maybe there is much more built-in kind of bias or knowledge around it from a lay consumer than I'm aware of. But most people, I think coffee is coffee is coffee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you start throwing these words at them and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about.
I just want a coffee.
Did you just say species and taxonomy? I don't want to think about that.
Yeah. I feel like if we didn't ask the question about the psychological element, we wouldn't do the conversation justice. So I'm happy we were able to at least begin with a little bit of speculation. Maybe we can find somebody for the show who can jump into that deeper. But I think at the end of it, we kind of have posed this question, is Arabica superior to Robusta? I'm leaning towards the overall answer being no.
I think it's, superior for who? Superior to what end? And if your starting point is just that the only thing that matters is what's in the cup, I think you can make a compelling argument that Arabica is better than Robusta. Mm-hmm. If your answer is more complicated than that, if it's what matters to a farmer, if it's what matters for, the future longevity of the coffee industry as a whole, then I think you have a different answer. And I think that answer has to include Robusta.
So maybe another question is, should we pit these two species against one another, brother against brother or sister against sister, what have you? Is that even fair to do?
No, it's not fair to do, but we love a good cage match, don't we? I've been watching Glow, the Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling. It's good to have a storyline. No, I don't. It's not fair to do from a practical perspective, but I mean, it makes sense that that's what we've done, right? They're different. They have different qualities, and people, I think humans are just oriented to categorize things and make relative judgments. Again, though, we've actually done so little exploration of coffee in general, but Robusta in particular. I think that as we learn more and more about what its potential is, that easy kind of cage match might begin to disintegrate a little bit. People will ask more nuanced questions about superior in what way or better for what. Right now, we don't have a lot of answers to those questions because we're just at the beginning of even asking.
And it sounds like WCR is at the beginning of some new projects as well. You want to talk about those just a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, I mentioned that we are expanding into research on Robusta starting this year. And the kind of tangible piece of that, there's a couple different pieces of it. We are hoping to begin work on a multi-location Robusta trial. So we have a version of this for Arabica that's up and running, and we have 24 partner countries in it. And the idea is that you take some, identified high-performing, good Arabica varieties, and you plant them in different kinds of environments in different locations around the world, and you sort of see how they do in these different environments. There's lots of varieties that they were developed in one place or selected in one place, and we've never really seen what their potential is in a different place or in a different environment. And we do that with also a specific eye to kind of climate change. So we make sure that some of these trials are in hot, dry places, some of them are in cooler, wetter places, so that we can see, how the genetics are interacting with the environment. So we're pretty far along with that for Arabica, but we would like to do the same for Robusta and kind of collect, some of the best examples of Robusta that are being commercially grown out there and put them in these different climates and locations and environments and really generate hard, comparable data that's going to help us learn what these different kind of best in class varieties are capable of, and potentially help expand access to some of the better ones in different parts of the world. So that's one component. That wouldn't be up and running right away, but we are beginning to have those conversations. And then I mentioned the breeding work. So we just announced today, kind of, that we are establishing a new breeding hub in Africa, in Rwanda, for Arabica. So this is a partnership with the Rwanda Agriculture Board. They have some incredibly skilled breeders there, and they're going to kind of serve as a hub for the whole region. So if you're Kenya or Tanzania or Republic of Congo or Burundi, and you would like to work on some dedicated new varieties for your country, you can come through this hub and bring the kind of best local material that you have, the best varieties that are currently growing in your country, and work with us and the breeders at Rwanda Agricultural Board to make crosses and try to develop something that would be really optimal for you. So that's for Arabica, and that's going to happen. That's already kind of underway, actually. That's the hub is up and running, and crosses are being made, and we're working with various countries. We hope to do the same with Robusta. Probably the kind of powerhouse Robusta country in Africa is Uganda. It's one of the places where Robusta evolved. They are really putting a ton of effort and money into their coffee sector right now. They're trying to triple their production. And all of this is coming from like a presidential directive, so it goes to the very, very top. So there's a huge commitment right now in Uganda to coffee, and they do grow some Arabica, but they're primarily a Robusta producer. I think about 90% of their production is Robusta. And they're very interested in helping us jumpstart a kind of regional program for Robusta breeding in Africa. So that, I think, is super exciting. And then we're already, kind of hard at work thinking about, this is still in the planning stages, but, thinking about strategies for, I mentioned, like crossing Arabica and Robusta again, or even another idea that we haven't done it yet, but that we're thinking about is, can we recreate Arabica? Can we take the two parents of Arabica, Robusta and Eugenioides and make new crosses and try to come up with
interesting.
an interesting, Arabica like. I know, yeah, it's really fun. I know it's like sci-fi on the one hand, and also it's like the most basic plant breeding, like what farmers have been doing for 200 years. It's like you take a little pollen and you blow it over here, and So anyway, it's very exciting. There's a lot of different directions that this could go in, and part of it also is going to be looking at quote unquote like softer elements of the science. So looking at socioeconomics, what makes a Robusta producer different from an Arabica producer? What are the conditions for which Robusta makes more sense, Arabica makes more sense? We have some kind of anecdotal general feel for this, but as we get trials in the ground and as we really ramp up our Robusta research program, I'm quite sure we'll be looking more specifically at some of these questions, because this is a huge question in coffee right now. You're trying to help a farmer prepare for climate change. One of the ways that you can do that, by no means the only way, but one of the ways is looking at what plants they have and looking at, is there a plant that's better suited for not just the climate you have today, but what you think the climate's going to be in 20 years in that location. And it's pretty clear that in many places Robusta might be a good bet, but we don't have a lot of granularity around that. It's kind of a gut instinct. And so, getting some real research behind that, I think, is something that we're looking forward to.
Yeah, it's exciting to hear all that y'all are doing. So excited to see what comes in the future with WCR.
Well, we're just so excited to find out too. I mean, that's the cool thing about science, is like, we have no idea what we're going to find. We just know it's going to be fun.
Right on.
Yeah. So I think this is a really cool topic. I'm so glad that you guys were interested in tackling it. And I think it's super relevant for this conversation, this really important conversation about like, what is the future of coffee? If you think about between now and 2050, all this climate change research is like by 2050 or by 2100, the world will look like X. But let's just say 2050. By 2050, that's 35 years from now-ish. That's like the life of a coffee tree. So pretty much every coffee tree on the planet should be replaced between now and 2050. That's not actually going to happen, but in theory,
Right.
If you had like efficient farming methods, you would be replacing all those trees. Well, what are we going to replace them with? And I think this question of Arabica versus Robusta is a really interesting one, and clearly on the minds of farmers. I mean, that's something that these are the kinds of questions that they have to ask themselves every day.
Well, Hannah, thanks for joining us for the conversation and jumping in the deep end on something to ruffle some feathers here on the Coffee Podcast.
Okay, well, I pre-apologize if I got any facts or figures wrong. You can take me to task on Twitter. And I do really encourage people to look into the R program that Coffee Quality Institute has created, because I think it's a really interesting other element of this component that I'm not an expert on by any means. So please don't hold me to any of the statements I made about that. But I think that's a really easy place for people who are interested in quality in particular to begin thinking about this Robusta thing.
If you hear that smacking in the background, that's my dog chewing on a coffee bean. Thanks for tuning into the first episode in this new series on coffee myths. There are a lot of exciting episodes ahead, so stay with us. If you want more of the Coffee Podcast, remember you can sign up for our newsletter for free on our website. We promise not to spam you. I hate email spam. I hate it so much. So we won't be doing that. Don't worry. Also, if you sign up, you'll be in an advantage for learning about cool new content and winning cool coffee prizes. So go ahead and sign up for that newsletter. No harm, no foul there. And honestly, it's just good to be back. So thanks for tuning in. And as always, and until next time, happy brewing.